The sun was a merciless hammer in the Arizona territory, and for Jedediah Stone, its final blow was about to fall. He wasn't dying of thirst, though his tongue was a swollen, cracked piece of leather in his mouth. He wasn't dying from the fall, though his bones screamed in protest from the jagged rocks below. No, Jedediah was dying from a bullet hole in his side and the poison of a broken brotherhood. The last thing he heard wasn't the rattle of a snake or the cry of a hawk, but the mocking laughter of Silas Kane, his partner, his friend, echoing down the canyon walls as he rode away with their shared fortune in gold dust, leaving Jedediah to the buzzards. But fate in the unforgiving West has a cruel sense of irony. Death was coming, but it wasn't riding a pale horse. It was walking on worn leather boots, carrying a loaf of bread and a canteen of water. The world had shrunk to a searing circle of light and a universe of pain. Jedediah Stone lay twisted against a slab of sun-baked sandstone, the coppery scent of his own blood thick in his nostrils. Each ragged breath was a fresh torment, pulling at the fiery agony in his side, where Silas's bullet had torn through him. Just this morning they had been brothers, not by blood but by something deeper, by shared sweat, shared risk, and the shared dream of striking it rich. For 2 years they had chipped away at the stubborn heart of the Dragoon Mountains, their pickaxes ringing out a duet of hope. And then yesterday they found it. A vein of gold, so thick and pure it looked like a solidified river of sunlight trapped in the quartz. Jedediah remembered the wild look in Silas Kane's eyes, a gleam that, in his foolish trust, he had mistaken for shared joy. They had filled every last pouch, their hands trembling with the weight of their future. "We're kings, Jed," Silas had roared his voice, bouncing off the granite walls of their small claim. Kings of Arizona. The plan was simple. They'd ride to Tucson, register the claim, bank the gold, and then live the lives they'd only ever dared to whisper about around the campfire. Jedediah dreamed of a small ranch, a piece of land, to call his own, far from the grit and gamble of a prospector's life. He wasn't sure what Silas dreamed of. Kane was always more private, his ambitions sharper and less defined. Now Jedediah knew. Silas dreamed of it all for himself. The betrayal had been as swift as a striking sidewinder. They were riding through the narrow, winding passages of Serpent's Moor Canyon, a treacherous shortcut Silas had insisted on. "It'll shave a day off the ride, Jed. Get us to the assayer's office before any claim jumpers get a whiff of our luck." Jedediah had been leading his mule Dusty when he felt a strange premonition, a cold prickle on his neck that had nothing to do with the morning chill. He turned. Silas was 20 feet back, his Colt Peacemaker already drawn the barrel, a single dark eye staring right at him. There was no anger on Silas's face, no rage, just a cold, predatory calm that was more terrifying than any shouted threat. "Silas, what in God's name are you doing?" Jedediah's hand hovered instinctively near his own pistol. "Business, Jed. Just business." Silas had said, his voice smooth as polished riverstone. "Half a fortune is a good life, but a whole fortune, that's a kingdom." The world exploded in a deafening roar and a flash of white-hot pain. The force of the shot threw Jedediah from his saddle. He landed hard, his head cracking against a rock. Dazed and bleeding, he watched as Silas calmly walked over. He didn't even look at Jedediah's face. He just untied the heavy saddlebags of gold from Jed's mule, loaded them onto his own horse, and then with a final chilling act of cruelty, he kicked Jed's canteen away, its precious water spilling into the thirsty dust. "The canyon will take care of the rest," Silas had said, mounting his horse. He looked down at Jedediah one last time. A flicker of something, was it pity? No, it was contempt in his eyes. "You were always too trusting, Jed. It's the one thing that made you a good partner. And a perfect fool. Then came the laughter. It wasn't the booming, good-natured laugh Jedediah had known for 2 years. It was a hollow, cruel sound that seemed to mock the very sky, the rocks, the sun itself. It echoed long after Silas and the jingle of their stolen future had disappeared around the bend. Now, hours later, the echoes had faded, replaced by the drone of flies and the pounding of blood in his ears. The sun beat down, cooking the rock he lay on. Delirium began to set in weaving visions of cool water and soft beds, with the nightmarish image of Silas's cold smile. He knew the stages of death in the desert. First thirst, then madness, then the circling buzzards patient as stone. He closed his eyes, a single bitter tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. He had dug his fortune from the earth, only to have it bury him. He was thinking of his mother, of the apple pie she used to bake, when a new sound cut through the haze. The soft scuff of a boot on gravel. It was too light to be a man, too deliberate to be an animal. He forced his heavy eyelids open. A silhouette stood against the blinding sun, a figure of impossible grace in this land of harsh angles. As his vision swam into focus, he saw her. A woman, her face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, carrying a small cloth bundle in one hand and a rifle in the other. She moved with a quiet confidence that spoke of a life lived in tune with this unforgiving land. For a moment, he thought he was already dead, and this was an angel come to guide him. Then she knelt beside him, and the angel spoke. "You're a long way from anywhere to be dying," she said, her voice low and steady like cool water flowing over stone. Ilara Vance moved through the canyons with a practiced silence, a ghost in her own secluded kingdom. This desolate landscape of rock and thorn was not a prison to her. It was a sanctuary. It had been 5 years since she and her father had been forced from their ranch near Prescott, ruined by a land swindler with a silver tongue and a heart of flint, a man named Silas Kane. After her father's spirit broke and he passed on, Ilara had retreated here to this small hidden cabin her grandfather had built, wanting nothing more than to be forgotten by the world that had taken everything from her. She survived. She knew the land's secrets, which plants healed and which poisoned, where the hidden springs trickled even in the driest seasons, and how to track the flight of a hawk to find game. Her life was a quiet ritual of solitude, measured by sunrises and sunsets. Her only companions, the wind and the memories she tried so hard to suppress. That day she was checking her snares near the canyon mouth when she saw them, the buzzards. They weren't circling high and lazy, but low and impatient, a sure sign of a fresh kill or something close to it. Curiosity, a dangerous but deeply human instinct, pulled her forward. She moved cautiously, her Winchester rifle held loosely in her arms, expecting to find a dying coyote or a stranded longhorn. Instead, she found a man. He was a mess of dried blood dust and desperation. The wound in his side was ugly, caked with dirt but still weeping. His face, bristly with a dark beard, was gaunt, his lips cracked and blackened by dehydration. Yet even in this broken state, there was a strength about him, in the broad set of his shoulders, the stubborn clench of his jaw, even in unconsciousness. He was dressed in the sturdy clothes of a prospector. Near him lay an empty, overturned canteen, a final act of cruelty she understood all too well. This was no accident. Someone had left him here. Ilara's first instinct was survival. A man like this meant trouble. He meant questions, complications, and a breach in the careful solitude she had built. The world of men was a world of greed and violence, a world she had fled. The smart thing to do was to walk away. Leave him to the buzzards and the sun. It was the law of the desert. She stood over him for a long moment, the rifle heavy in her hands, her heart a cold knot in her chest. But then he groaned a low, guttural sound of pure misery, and his eyes fluttered open. They were a startling hazel clouded with pain and confusion, but in their depths she saw not a predator but a victim. He looked at her not with demand, but with a kind of dazed wonder, as if he couldn't believe she was real. And in that moment, the law of the desert was overruled by a law far older. She saw not a stranger, not a threat, but a human soul in its final extremity. She saw her father's face, in his last days, the same look of weary surrender. Her carefully constructed walls of indifference crumbled. "You're a long way from anywhere to be dying," she said, the words coming out rougher than she intended. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp escaped. His eyes pleaded. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of her own lonely years, Ilara made her choice. She set down her rifle and unwrapped the bundle she carried. Inside was a small loaf of dark, dense bread and a piece of dried venison. She broke off a tiny piece of bread, knelt beside him, and gently pushed it between his lips. "Don't swallow," she commanded softly. "Just let it soften." She uncorked her own canteen, the one she had filled that morning from her secret spring. She poured a small amount of water onto her handkerchief and dabbed it onto his cracked lips, then let a few drops trickle into his mouth. He choked slightly, then swallowed with a pained desperation that twisted her gut. He was too heavy to carry. The wound was bad. Her cabin was a mile away, up a steep, hidden path. Getting him there would be a Herculean task, one that would drain every ounce of her strength and put her at immense risk. If whoever did this came back, they would find them both. Still, she could not leave him. "All right, listen to me," she said, her voice firm, pulling him from the brink of unconsciousness. "We're going to move. It's going to hurt. If you want to live, you'll have to help me." He blinked a flicker of understanding in his pain-filled eyes. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. For the next hour, the canyon was filled with the sounds of a struggle not against another person, but against death itself. Ilara, using every bit of her wiry strength, looped his arm over her shoulders and heaved. Jedediah, fueled by the first drops of water and a primal will to live, tried to use his legs, his gasps of pain echoing in the oppressive silence. They moved, inch by agonizing inch, a slow, desperate crawl away from the place of his betrayal. She was his crutch, his anchor, the single point of focus in his swirling delirium. He was a dead weight, a dangerous burden, and yet she didn't let go. She had appeared with bread and mercy, and now, with grim determination, she was dragging him back into the world of the living. Ilara's cabin was little more than a single sturdy room, built of rock and timber, nestled so cleverly into a box canyon that you could be a stone's throw away and never see it. A curtain of wild vines masked the entrance, and the only approach was a narrow game trail a stranger would never find. Inside, it was Spartan, but clean. A stone hearth, a simple cot, a rough-hewn table and shelves lined with dried herbs, preserved foods, and a few worn books. This was her fortress. And now, for the first time in 5 years, it had been breached. Getting Jedediah onto the cot was the final exhausting battle. He collapsed onto the straw mattress, his body trembling with shock and exertion, and immediately fell into a fevered sleep. The next few days blurred into a grueling routine for Ilara. The bullet had gone clean through a miracle of sorts, but the risk of infection was high. She cleaned the wound as best she could with boiled water and whiskey from a small flask she kept for medicinal purposes. She made a poultice of yarrow and crushed willow bark, ancient remedies Her grandmother had taught her to fight the fever and the pain. She spent hours by his side, spooning thin broth and water between his lips. He was lost in a delirium, thrashing against unseen enemies. His words, a jumbled torrent of gold dust, and a single recurring name spat out like a curse: Silas. In his fever dreams, he was a captive audience to his own torment. He relived the glint of gold, the warmth of camaraderie around a campfire, only to have it curdle into the cold barrel of the peacemaker and Silas's mocking laughter. He felt the phantom pain of the bullet, the burning thirst, the despair. But now new sensations wove themselves into the nightmares: the gentle touch of a cool cloth on his forehead, the soothing, earthy scent of herbs, a low, calm voice that cut through the chaos, pulling him back from the edge. He would surface for brief moments of lucidity, his eyes struggling to focus. He saw a woman's silhouette against the firelight, her face a mixture of intense concentration and deep-seated weariness. He saw her strong, capable hands, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle, her movements efficient and sure. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where he was. He only knew that she was the anchor in his storm-tossed consciousness. One afternoon, nearly a week after she'd found him, the fever broke. Jedediah woke to the sound of a crackling fire and the smell of roasting rabbit. He felt weak, hollowed out, but the fiery haze was gone. He slowly turned his head. She was sitting at the table, her back to him, mending a tear in a deerskin tunic. The sunlight from the cabin's single small window caught the auburn highlights in her tightly braided brown hair. In the quiet domesticity of the moment, he was struck by a profound sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He tried to speak, his voice a dry croak. "Water." She turned, startled. Her eyes, a deep forest green, widened slightly when she saw he was awake and clear-headed. Without a word, she rose, ladled water from a bucket into a tin cup and brought it to him. She supported his head with one hand as he drank, his gratitude so immense it was almost painful. "Thank you." He rasped, his throat raw. She simply nodded, her expression unreadable, and returned to her chair. The silence stretched, filled only by the snap of the fire. "I'm Jedediah Stone," he said, wanting to fill the void. She hesitated for a beat. "Elara." She didn't offer a last name. The days that followed were quiet. Jedediah's strength returned slowly, agonizingly. At first he could only sit up for a few minutes at a time. Then he was able to stand, leaning on the wall for support. Soon he was hobbling around the small cabin, feeling the life flow back into his atrophied muscles. During this time they spoke little, but a silent language developed between them. He learned the rhythms of her life, her early morning, foraging the quiet hours she spent, tending to her small hidden garden, the evenings dedicated to reading by the fire. She in turn learned his quiet persistence, the way he pushed himself to heal, refusing to be an invalid. She saw the decency in his eyes, a stark contrast to the violence that had brought him to her door. He began to help in small ways, whittling a new handle for her axe, sorting beans for a stew, simply keeping the fire fed while she was out. These shared, simple tasks built a fragile bridge of trust over the chasm of their unknown pasts. One evening, as she was putting away a small carved wooden box, he saw the name etched into the lid, Vance. The name meant nothing to him, but he noted the careful, almost reverent way she handled it, a relic from a life he couldn't imagine. As he grew stronger, a tension began to build between them. The cabin, once a sanctuary for his healing, now felt small, charged with unspoken questions and a growing awareness of each other that went beyond patient and caregiver. He found himself watching the way the firelight played on her face, the quiet grace in her movements. She found herself listening for the sound of his steady breathing in the night, a comforting presence in the profound silence she had once cherished. The West was a place that forced intimacy through survival, and in the confines of that hidden cabin, two lonely souls were slowly, cautiously beginning to find a home in each other. He was a man who had lost everything to greed. She was a woman who had lost everything to the same. They were two halves of a shattered whole, unaware that the very man who had broken them both was the one thing that truly connected them. With each passing day, Jedediah shed more of the broken man Elara had found in the canyon. Color returned to his face. The haunted look in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, assessing gaze, and his movements regained their purpose. He began chopping firewood, his powerful shoulders bunching with the effort, the rhythmic thump of the axe, a new heartbeat in the quiet canyon. He helped Elara reinforce the small corral where she kept her 2 goats, his hands sure and skilled as he knotted ropes and reset posts. Their conversations deepened, moving from practical matters to cautious explorations of their pasts. He spoke of his childhood in Missouri, the son of a farmer with dreams bigger than the family plot. He talked about the lure of the West, the call of gold, the promise of a self-made life. He spoke of his partnership with Silas Kane, painting a picture of a deep friendship forged in hardship. He described their shared laughter, their mutual reliance, the way they could communicate with a single glance while working a rock face. He spoke of the man he thought he knew, not the monster who had left him for dead. Elara listened, her expression carefully neutral, but her heart ached with a strange mix of empathy and dread. She shared pieces of her own story, carefully omitting the names and places that were still open wounds. She spoke of her love for the land, taught to her by a father who believed ranching was a sacred trust. She described the beauty of their old homestead, the vast plains that rolled like a green ocean, the heartache of losing it all to a downturn in fortunes and a bad business deal. He was cheated, she said one evening, her voice barely a whisper as she stared into the flames of the hearth. My father. He was too trusting. He believed in the good of men, even when the devil came knocking with a smile and a contract. Jedediah stopped his whittling the knife, still in his hand. He looked at her, seeing for the first time the profound depth of the sorrow she kept so carefully guarded. I know something about that, he said softly. Trusting the wrong man. A bond was forming between them, stronger than the timber of the cabin. It was built in the shared glances over supper, the easy silence as they worked side by side, the way he'd instinctively reach out to steady her as she climbed a rocky path. A fragile romance was blooming in the harshest of soils, a testament to the stubborn resilience of the human heart. One night, a chill wind howled outside, rattling the single window shutter. They sat close to the fire, the warmth a welcome shield against the cold. Jedediah felt his strength had fully returned. His wound was a puckered scar, a dull ache, but his resolve was ironclad. The time for hiding was over. The time for justice was near. I have to go after him, Elara. He said, his voice low but firm. I can't let him get away with it. It's not just the gold. It's the principle. A man can't do that to another man and just ride away. Elara looked at him, her green eyes dark with a nameless fear. This world is full of men who do and get away with it. Vengeance is a hungry ghost, Jedediah. It devours the living. It's not vengeance, he argued, his voice rising with passion. It's a reckoning. He needs to be held accountable. I'll go to the law in Tucson. I'll tell them what happened. I'll tell them what Silas Kane did. He said the name without thinking, the name that had been a curse in his fever, dreams the name that was the engine of his purpose. Silas Kane. The effect on Ilara was instantaneous and devastating. She was holding a tin cup of chamomile tea, and it slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the stone floor and splashing hot liquid across the worn wooden planks. She didn't flinch. She didn't even seem to notice. She just stared at him, her face ashen, her body rigid as if struck by lightning. The warmth that had grown between them vanished, replaced by an Arctic chill that had nothing to do with the wind outside. "What did you say?" she whispered, her voice tight and brittle. Jedediah was confused. Silas Kane. He was my partner. The man who... Silas Kane. She repeated the name, a venomous hiss. She rose from her stool, her movements jerky and unnatural. She backed away from him towards the far wall of the cabin, as if he had suddenly transformed into a snake. Her eyes, which had so recently looked at him with burgeoning affection, were now wide with horror and a raw, visceral betrayal. "You," she breathed, a world of accusation in the single word. "You rode with him. You were his friend." "Ilara, what is it I don't understand?" Jedediah said, rising to his feet, his hands held out in a placating gesture. "Get out," she said, her voice shaking with a fury he had never imagined she possessed. She pointed a trembling finger toward the door. "Get out!" He was stunned into silence. The connection they had so carefully built over weeks of healing and quiet companionship had just been shattered by the ghost of a name. He was the man she had saved, the man she had nursed back from the dead. But now, in her eyes, he was something else entirely. He was tainted, contaminated by his association with the very devil she had run from. The canyon had brought them together, but a name, a single cursed name, was about to tear them apart. The command hung in the air, sharp and jagged as broken glass. "Get out!" Jedediah stood frozen, utterly bewildered. The warmth of the fire, the comfort of their shared space, had been replaced by a chasm of cold hostility. "Ilara, please," he said, taking a step toward her. "Talk to me. What does Silas Kane mean to you? Mean to me?" She laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. It was a raw, broken noise like tearing cloth. "He means a shallow grave for my father. He means a stolen legacy. He means the reason I live like a hermit in this god-forsaken canyon, while he lives like a king." She began to pace the small cabin, like a caged animal, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The dam of her composure, so carefully maintained for 5 years, had burst. The story poured out of her in a torrent of grief and rage. Her family name was Vance. They had owned the Circle Fifth Ranch, one of the most prosperous spreads in the Prescott Valley. Her father, Thomas Vance, was a good man, respected by all, but his handshake was his bond, and he was naive to the sharks that circled in polite society. Silas Kane, then a young, ambitious land speculator, long before he turned to prospecting, had arrived with maps, promises, and forged documents. He'd spoken of railroad expansions and water rights, convincing Thomas to enter a partnership to sign over portions of his land as collateral for a venture that was pure fiction. "He drained my father dry," Ilara said, her voice cracking. "Legal theft, the sheriff called it. Kane had the papers all signed and sealed. He took our land, our cattle, our home. He took everything. My father, he just faded. The shame of it ate him from the inside out. He died within a year, a proud man reduced to a ghost." She finally stopped pacing and turned to face Jedediah, her eyes blazing with unshed tears. "I buried him and I ran. I ran from the world that let men like Silas Kane flourish. I came here to be free of him, to never hear his name again. And then fate, in its infinite cruelty, sends me you, his partner, the man who helped him build the very fortune he probably used to buy his way to respectability." The pieces clicked into place for Jedediah with sickening clarity. the carved box with the name Vance, her story of a cheated father, her self-imposed exile. It all made a terrible tragic sense. He had been so consumed by his own betrayal that he never imagined his enemy had a history, a wake of destruction that stretched long before their gold claim. "Alara, I didn't know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I swear on my mother's grave I didn't know. I met him in a mining camp 2 years ago. He never spoke of his past. To me, he was just Silas. The man you trusted." She shot back her words, laced with acid. "Just like my father trusted him." The parallel was undeniable, and it shamed him. He saw now that his own gullibility wasn't just a personal failing, it was part of a pattern. Silas Kane was a predator, and he and Thomas Vance were just 2 of his victims. "He left me to die, Alara." Jedediah said, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. He gestured to the scar on his side. "He shot me and kicked my canteen into the dust for the same reason he ruined your father for profit. We are not on different sides of this. We are on the very same side. We were both his victims." Her fury began to recede, replaced by a wave of weary confusion. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not the partner of her enemy, but the man she had tended to the man who had chopped her firewood and shared his quiet strength. She saw the honesty in his hazel eyes, the shame and anger that mirrored her own. She sank onto her stool, her body slumping, as the adrenaline left her. "All this time," she murmured, "I've been hiding from his memory, praying I'd never have to face it again." Jedediah knelt before her, taking her hands in his. They were trembling. "You don't have to hide any more," he said, his grip firm and reassuring. "My quest for justice just got bigger. This isn't just about my gold anymore. It's about your father. It's about the Circle 5 ranch. It's about you." In that moment, their individual quests for vengeance and solitude merged into a single shared purpose. It was no longer his fight or her sorrow. It was theirs. The pain of the past had not torn them apart. It had forged a bond between them stronger than steel. His desire for a reckoning was now fueled by a need to restore her honor. Her seclusion was now challenged by a partner who understood her loss. He's made his fortune now. Jedediah continued, his mind already working planning. He won't be hiding in some mining camp. A man like that, he'll want to be seen. He'll want power. He'll have set himself up in a town somewhere playing the respectable businessman. Alara looked up, a new light in her eyes. Not hope, not yet. But something harder, resolve. "There's a town about 2 days' ride north of here. It's grown fast in the last year. They call it Redemption." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "I've heard whispers from the few traders who pass through. The man who runs it, who owns the saloon and holds the bank's charter, is a man who came into a great deal of money very suddenly. His name is Silas Kane." Jedediah's jaw tightened. "Redemption," he repeated softly. "Good. That's where we'll find him, and that's where he'll face his own." The cabin was no longer a refuge from the past, but a war room for the future. He was no longer just a man she had saved. He was her champion, and she was no longer a woman in hiding. She was the keeper of the truth and the reason for the fight. In the town of Redemption, Silas Kane was the very picture of success. He had used Jedediah's stolen gold to purchase influence brick by brick. He owned the Grand Palace Saloon, the finest establishment west of Santa Fe, was the majority shareholder in the bank, and had the town's sheriff, a weak-willed man named Barlow, tucked firmly in his pocket. He dressed in tailored suits, drank imported whiskey, and curated an air of untouchable authority. But beneath the polished veneer, Silas was a man haunted by a single careless mistake. He had not made sure Jedediah Stone was dead. The desert was supposed to be a perfect accomplice, its heat and scavengers erasing all evidence. But whispers like dust devils had begun to swirl. A trapper passing through the territory spoke of strange tracks near Serpent's Moor. A prospector swore he'd seen a ghost matching Jedediah's description. These were flimsy rumors, but they were enough to prick at Silas's carefully constructed peace. A ghost couldn't testify, but a living man could bring his entire empire crashing down. He would not allow it. He summoned his right-hand man, a hired gun, named Lefty Rawlins. Lefty was a hulking, silent man with a dead eye and a reputation for finishing jobs. His nickname came from the fact that he was missing 2 fingers on his right hand, making his gun hand unnaturally fast and deadly. "There's a loose end," Silas said, swirling brandy in a crystal glass in his opulent office above the saloon. "From my prospecting days. A partner. He had an accident in Serpent's Moor Canyon." Lefty just watched him, his face impassive. "I need you to ride out there." Silas continued, not meeting Lefty's gaze. "Sweep the area. There are rumors of a recluse living in the canyons, a woman. If you find my old partner, or anyone who might have helped him, extinguish the problem. Quietly. No witnesses." "And the woman?" Lefty asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Silas paused, a flicker of coldness in his eyes. "No witnesses," he repeated. He tossed a heavy purse of coins onto the desk. "Find him, finish him." Back in the hidden cabin, the atmosphere had changed. The quiet solitude had been replaced by a tense, focused energy. Jedediah and Ilara were no longer just survivors. They were soldiers preparing for a siege. Jedediah's knowledge of Silas's cunning and Ilara's intimate understanding of the terrain became their primary weapons. "Silas won't come himself," Jedediah explained as he meticulously cleaned and oiled his Colt revolver, a weapon Ilara had kept from her father. "He's a businessman now. He pays other men to do his dirty work. He'll send someone ruthless, someone who won't ask questions." Ilara nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration as she sketched a map of the surrounding canyons in the dirt floor with a stick. "The only way to this cabin is the game trail. It's narrow with high walls on either side, a perfect ambush point. But they might try to come over the ridge." They worked together with a seamless efficiency, born of shared purpose. Jedediah, using his prospector's knowledge of rock and leverage, helped Ilara set up rock falls that could be triggered by cutting a single rope, capable of blocking the main paths into their box canyon. Ilara, using her knowledge of the land, laid out snares and deadfalls on the less obvious trails designed not to kill, but to maim and slow down any intruders. She showed him how to use her father's old Winchester rifle, a weapon she handled with practiced ease. He watched, impressed, as she hit a pine cone from 50 yards away. "My father insisted I learn," she said, a sad smile touching her lips. "He said the West doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. It only cares if you're fast or you're dead." In the evenings, the strategic planning would give way to a deeper connection. They would share stories, no longer hiding the painful parts. He told her of his admiration for the man he thought Silas was making the betrayal cut that much deeper. She told him more about her father, about the songs he used to sing, and the pride he took in his land. They were armoring each other's souls for the fight to come. The romance that had been a fragile bloom was now being tempered in the fire of imminent danger. One night, as they stood outside the cabin, watching the moon rise over the canyon rim, Jedediah turned to her. "I never should have survived that canyon." "Ilara," he said, his voice low, "when you found me, you didn't just save my life. You gave me something to live for again. something more important than gold. He reached out and gently touched her cheek. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement of the truth in his words. Before him, she was merely existing. Now she was fighting to live. Their moment was shattered by a distant sound, the faint whinny of a horse carried on the night wind. It was too far to be a threat, but it was a clear signal. The storm was no longer gathering. It had arrived. Ilara's eyes met Jedediah's, and the same grim understanding passed between them. She went to the cabin and emerged with the Winchester. He checked the action on his Colt. The time for preparation was over. Lefty Rawlins and his men were coming, and the canyon that had been Ilara's sanctuary was about to become a battlefield. The dawn broke cold and grey, the sun a pale disk behind a thin veil of clouds. The usual morning chorus of birds was absent, a heavy silence hanging over the canyon, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Jedediah and Ilara were in position, hidden amongst a cluster of boulders overlooking the narrow game trail that led to their cabin. From their vantage point, they were invisible with a clear line of sight. They didn't have to wait long. 3 riders appeared at the far end of the trail, moving slowly, their eyes scanning the canyon walls. The man in the load was huge, a mountain of a man on a black horse. Even from a distance, Jedediah could see the glint of a pistol holstered on his left hip. Lefty Rawlins. 3 of them. Ilara whispered, her voice steady, despite the tension that coiled in her stomach. The Winchester felt solid and familiar in her hands. "The big one in the lead is the one Silas sent," Jedediah murmured back, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "The other 2 are just hired muscle. We let them get to the bottleneck." The riders advanced their horses, picking their way carefully over the rocky ground. They reached the narrowest part of the trail, a section where the canyon walls pressed in, leaving barely enough room for 2 horses to pass side by side. It was the spot Ilara had marked on her dirt map. "Now," Jedediah said. Ilara took a deep breath, aimed high above the riders at a frayed rope tied to a precariously balanced deadfall pine, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot was like the sky splitting open. The bullet sliced through the rope. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a groaning crack of timber, the massive pine tree and an avalanche of rocks and dirt crashed down onto the trail behind the riders, completely blocking their path of retreat. The horses panicked, rearing and screaming. The 2 hired guns fought to control their mounts, their faces masks of surprise and fear. Lefty Rawlins, however, was different. He calmed his horse with a firm hand and a low word, his eyes instantly scanning the ridge where the shot had come from. He was a professional. "They're up there," he bellowed, drawing his pistol. "Spread out, flush them out." Jedediah fired his Colt not at the men, but at the rock face just above them. Chips of stone exploded outwards, forcing the men to dive for cover. This was their plan. Use the canyon, not brute force. Harass, confuse, and separate them. One of the gunmen, a lanky man with a desperate face, broke from cover and tried to scramble up the scree slope. He ran right into one of Ilara's snares. A rope loop tightened around his ankle, and he was violently jerked off his feet, his head hitting a rock with a sickening thud. 1 down. Lefty and the remaining gunmen were pinned down. They exchanged fire with Jedediah and Ilara. The canyon now a roaring echo chamber of ricocheting bullets. "This is a fool's game," Jedediah yelled down his voice, bouncing off the walls. "Your boss, Kane, he left me for dead. This is my claim, my justice. You're getting paid to die for a thief. I'm getting paid to kill you," Lefty roared back, firing a shot that whizzed perilously close to Jedediah's head. Under the cover of Lefty's fire, the third man began to circle around, trying to find another way up the ridge to flank them. But Ilara had anticipated this. As he crept through a thicket of manzanita, his boot came down on the trigger of a deadfall trap. A heavy, sharpened log held back by tension swung down from the trees like a pendulum, catching him in the chest and sending him flying. 2 down. Now it was just Lefty. The massive gunman was trapped. His escape route blocked, his men gone. He was enraged, firing wildly up at the ridge. Jedediah and Ilara held their fire, letting him waste his ammunition. When the frantic clicking of an empty hammer echoed in the sudden silence, Jedediah stood up. "It's over, Rawlins," he called out. "You can walk out of here and live." Lefty Rawlins stared up at him, his face a mask of sweat and fury. He dropped the empty pistol, and to Jedediah's surprise, let out a booming laugh. "You think Cain sent me to just kill you? He sent me to make sure." With impossible speed, he pulled a second gun, a smaller Colt from a hidden holster, and fired. Jedediah felt the bullet tear through the sleeve of his shirt, a searing line of fire along his arm. At the same moment, the blast of Ilara's Winchester roared next to him. Lefty staggered back, a red flower blooming on his shoulder. He dropped the second gun, clutching his arm and cursing. Defeated, wounded, and alone, Lefty Rawlins surrendered. They tied him securely and left him with a canteen of water far from the cabin. When Sheriff Barlow finally gets out here, Jedediah told him, "You tell him who sent you. You tell him everything." But Jedediah knew it wasn't over. Lefty was just a symptom. The disease was in redemption. "I have to face him, Ilara," he said that evening as she bandaged his arm. "This ends now. In town. You won't go alone," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "This is my fight, too." They rode into redemption the next day, not as fugitives, but as avengers. They went straight to the Grand Palace Saloon. Silas Cain was in his office, and when he saw Jedediah Stone walk through the door alive and well with a determined woman at his side, every drop of blood drained from his face. "Jed," he stammered, reaching for the derringer he kept in his desk drawer. "Don't," Jedediah warned, his Colt already in his hand. Ilara stepped forward. "My name is Ilara Vance," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with the authority of a life reclaimed. "My father was Thomas Vance. Does that name ring a bell, Mr. Cain?" Silas's composure finally shattered. The carefully constructed world of the respectable businessman collapsed, revealing the craven thief beneath. He saw not just Jedediah, the ghost of his betrayal, but Ilara, the ghost of a crime he thought long buried. He was cornered. He made a desperate move, lunging for the derringer, but Jedediah didn't shoot. In a flash, he closed the distance and landed a single powerful punch that sent Silas sprawling. He didn't want him dead. He wanted him ruined. They dragged him out into the main street, where Jedediah told the gathering crowd the whole story, the stolen gold, the attempted murder. Then Ilara told her story of the Circle Fifth Ranch and the swindle that had destroyed her family. The people of Redemption, who had both feared and respected Cain, now looked at him with contempt. Sheriff Barlow, seeing the tide turn, had no choice but to place Silas Cain under arrest. Their fight was over. As they stood on the dusty street of the town named Redemption, Jedediah looked at Ilara. The canyon had nearly been his grave, but she had turned it into his rebirth. She had offered him bread and mercy, and in doing so, had found the strength to claim her own justice. He took her hand. "What now?" he asked. "The Circle 5 is still there," she said, a glimmer of a smile on her face. "It's just land. It'll need a lot of work. I'm good with my hands." Jedediah said, his voice full of a promise that had nothing to do with gold and everything to do with building a future. Together they turned their backs on the town and rode east towards a new dawn and a life they would build from the ashes of their past. And so the story of Jedediah Stone and Alara Vance comes to a close. It began with a brutal act of greed in the dust of a lonely canyon, but it ended with a testament to the enduring power of human decency. It reminds us that even in the most unforgiving landscapes, mercy can appear when we least expect it, and that a shared purpose can forge a bond stronger than any betrayal. Their journey wasn't just about vengeance. It was about reclaiming what was stolen, not just gold or land, but honor, identity, and the right to build a future. It proves that sometimes the greatest treasure isn't what you dig from the earth, but what you find in the heart of another. If this story of survival justice and unexpected love in the Old West moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button to let me know you enjoyed it. Share this video with someone who loves a classic tale of romance and redemption. And most importantly, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. We have many more stories to tell, and we wouldn't want you to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.